Okay, so I think we've already seen some different sensibilities emerging here between those who are still invested in utopia and those who are more nihilist and not invested in utopia. Maybe this is a generational difference, maybe this is a geographical difference. This is yet to be seen. And it's the other problem that's come up that I think will arise again in the current session is about the validity or not of the avant-garde, whether this still exists or the avant-garde is one more thing to be incinerated and put in a pile of ashes on the pharmacist's shelf. So the next session we have two really good speakers. The first is David Riff, who's sitting to my left. David is a British art critic and an extremely good translator who has been living in Moscow since 2003. You've all got the little CVs, so I'm not going to repeat this, but just to say that he's an important collaborator with two groups in Moscow. One is Stodelat, and he edited their newspaper between 2003 and 2008, and then he's also collaborates with Dmitry Gutov on the Karl Marx School of English, which, sorry?
The Karl Marx School of the English Language.
Oh, Karl Marx School of the English Language. Okay, and David's going to talk, I think, about sort of changing ideas of autonomy since the transition in Russia, but I'm sure it will be more open. Anyway, here you go.
Yes, maybe I should actually start out by clarifying the topic of my talk, which I quickly announced and of course then found myself departing from the second I started to write something and think about something. I should say to begin with that I don't believe in an absolute autonomy of art. And I don't want to here now reproduce a kind of legitimation of that kind of thinking. I think it's not that I don't think that there are imminent problems to art that we can talk about, imminent breaks within art history that we should discuss, but I believe that under certain circumstances, a rhetorics of autonomy has an absolutely laming effect and is used as an ideology introduced under certain circumstances in certain conditions, and it doesn't take much effort really to undermine those rhetorics and to subvert them, to ask questions and to immediately see that they actually do serve a broader social function that doesn't only legitimate this wonderful practice called art. I say this because over the last, I would say, 5, 7, 10 years, in Russia we've seen a huge transformation of the existing art system. We've seen the introduction of market-based let's say, framings of art. A gallery system has emerged where there was none. An institutional system is emerging where there was a different institutional system before. We see a radical transformation, really, of the conditions of artistic production and of the presentation of art. This proliferation obviously is not just an effect of, let's say, democracy coming to Russia and bringing free artistic expression along with it, but is related to the way that the new elite, one could argue about whether it's actually so new, but the elite that is currently in control of means of production, to use very Marxist terms, is in need of a fundamental legitimization after an epoch of what we could call renewed primitive accumulation. We could say that the 1990s were an incredibly violent form where crime in a cumulative process was almost ubiquitous, and now there is a real need for this new elite to show that it is actually not a group of bandits, thieves, corrupt bureaucrats, but intelligent, noble, even aristocratic subjects who are really the subjects of history. In order to do this, there's a real need to present some kind of visual sauce for this idea, and this visual sauce is contemporary art. So we see people who have absolutely no love, no interest, no stake in an autonomy of art, suddenly creating autonomous art spaces. white cubes and all the variants of the white cubes that you would see that show you the possibility of inserting a radically different context into a very heterogeneous, unevenly developed post-Soviet landscape, a context in which art could survive on its own and be shown, and if you enter the space, you're completely out of the world that you just came out of, and you're now in the presence of art. Actually, what you see behind this facade of total autonomy is something quite different. You see a very contradictory set of interests, desires, and schemes, basically, that really are aimed toward legitimating a new class that doesn't really know what it wants. What you see, for an example, in art spaces, if you analyze concretely what an institution in Russia, your typical art foundation that has been founded, let's say, in the last 2 or 3 years, what you would see is a structure, for an example, of parallel investments into different aesthetic programs that would eventually contradict one another and force the foundation to collapse. Each of these programs would purport a certain autonomy of art, a certain autonomy of artistic experience, but what you have is that exhibition after exhibition that is indeed an experience that can be reflected on without looking at all of these different factors. The art space basically reveals itself to be anything but autonomous. So this is the first part of what I want to say. You have the illusion of autonomy being created even on an architectural level, but this autonomy completely collapses after several exhibitions of so-called autonomous art. That's one part. The other part is that artists themselves have responded to these new conditions by strangely reintroducing concepts of autonomy that, let's say, in the former West, and this is actually one of the conditions of the former West's formerness, have been discredited or abandoned, burnt to ashes, perhaps, to use your nice metaphor. They've been maybe also sublated in a Hegelian way and internalized by the art system. I'm talking about, for example, the theories of autonomy of not so much even Adorno, but maybe Clement Greenberg or Michael Fried, for an example. Figures who dominated the former Western art context and now are somewhat forgotten. One key moment, I think, in all of these changes in the Russian art scene was when the artist Anatolia Swarovski, former actionist, interventionist, political artist, someone who always linked his own artistic practice to politics very clearly, abandoned his previous practices and moved very ideologically to a position that he calls himself autonomy and the return of the artwork, the return of an auratic artwork that would be really capable of being art, almost art, as Ad Reinhardt would have said. Remembering Ad Reinhardt, one could of course suspect Anatolia Swarovski of doing a similar kind of tricky move. As you probably know, in recent years, Ad Reinhardt's communist cartoons that were made under a pseudonym were published, and it became clear that actually art as art was an elaborate smokescreen for a very subversive, strange political practice that didn't actually pan out in the way that Ad Reinhardt wanted. He became the symbol for autonomy, and there's a certain kind of tragedy to this. I'm not so sure still. I haven't quite committed to abandoning the idea that Anatolia Swarovski may be the next Ad Reinhardt, but there's at the same time, one has the strange feeling that one is seeing a replay, a farcical replay of another figure emerging, the figure of Clement Greenberg himself. Swarovski recently, I was meaning to quote a very recent, as of yet unpublished text of his, where he is talking about the role of contemporary art in modernization of Russia, and where he really says that he almost appropriates Medvedev and Putin's rhetorics of modernization and says contemporary art has an important role to play. It's an important modernizing force. We must put ourselves on the side of this great social movement, so to speak. which is quite a strange thing. If you think about this is an artist who had nothing to do with Kremlin politics, was rejecting the very idea of representational politics and of power structures in the art world as such. So this is really this is a tremendous challenge somehow to look at Swarovski and not to see a latter-day Clement Greenberg, somebody who would start out as a Marxist, as a Trotskyist perhaps, or an anarcho-Trotskyist, you could call Swarovski at certain points in his political development, and who would then slowly move to the figure of a kind of aestheticist lecturing on art as art on, let's say, not the Voice of America, but Russia Today. So that you would have suddenly this reinvented autonomy of art being used much in the same way, and one could imagine, seriously, I mean, if you think about it, you could imagine this. A strong Russian state with its own television channel, doing a kind of maneuver of that was done with the abstract expressionists in the 40s and 50s, at the time of the Cold War, only not now to fight against the communist East, but to establish perhaps a model of art for the future East that we see emerging. Now, this is a very negative view of this move to the autonomy of the object, the autonomy of art, and that negative view could be confirmed if you take the theories of Greenberg and Fried, for an example, and apply them to this new object-based practice of an artist who had not done this previously to the works themselves. They would appear to be hollow, literal, theatrical, basically assisted ready-mades used as props in a live theater, in a spectacle put on by the artist who uses them basically transitorily and who will move on in his next stage to another practice. Who knows what it will be. Maybe he will be next time talking about the total heteronomy of art and how art has dematerialized. We don't know. But this is, so the second moment of a critique would be not to say that he's the next Clement Greenberg who's propagandizing of Russia Today, but to be the next Robert Morris, almost, who's attacked by the theories of Michael Fried that he actually himself has been actualizing. So that's the second stage. The third moment is that makes all of this quite interesting is that somebody actually coming out and saying, look at this new model of autonomy, look at Clement Greenberg, look at Michael Fried, reread these texts, I'm going to republish them in my own journal. This is something that Swarovski is now planning to do. Actually engenders a very interesting process of self-education and forces people like me who read Fried and Greenberg practically in high school and don't remember really what it was all about, who have sublated these theories, burnt them to ashes, ingested them, and somehow live with them as a parasite in your body, to suddenly start identifying these things and to look at them more closely. I think that when you start to do this, when you start to actually read these theories, applying these aesthetic theories to this artist, you see something quite different. You see in his work traces of the violence of the previous epoch. You can read these works very unautonomously, very socially, almost as illustrations to a social process, but only after really going and using this formalist criticism as a real critical instrument. Now, before I get too confused myself in what I'm going to say, I think that process would be really a process of self-education. It would be a process of forcing yourself to actualize things that the former West has practically forgotten. And I think that this is something that is very valuable, for an example, about that introduction of autonomy. It perhaps, in a context like in Russia today, we could imagine these strange actualizations taking place not as appropriations of a new elite that is trying to use the entire arsenal of history to legitimate its own position, but as what the writer and artist Peter Weiss, who some of you may know, called An Aesthetics of Resistance. Maybe you are familiar with this book. It's a very famous, very fat novel about how people who are in the communist underground in Nazi Germany are going to museums and looking at, for example, the same Pergamon altar that Albert Speer used as the model for his Zeppelin Feldbühne, to see narratives of class struggle, to see the vanquishing of the weak by the powerful, to establish political narratives that have a strong relevance today. Perhaps Osmalovsky's practices and Osmalovsky's own kind of artificiality of introducing this Greenbergian and Freudian rhetorics could be used as a point of departure for that kind of process of self-education, as a provocation. I think that that's its main use. And when we look at these new rhetorics of autonomy, of these new ideologies of the purity of art, we can use them to actually really look at art again, not to just eat ashes of art, but to actually look at art and to try to find a completely other side that would have nothing in common with this bourgeois autonomy that is being introduced now. I think I'm going to end on that and not make this too long. And later we'll make some questions.
Yes, thank you very much, David. So the plan for this morning's session is to have David and then go straight on to Katerina, and then we'll have questions at the end. So please note them down, and we're going to come back to David in half an hour.